Muy buenas noches, muy buenas tardes y muy buenos días.
Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. From Berlin, Germany, we begin the special broadcast of Demolishing Political Myths in this new series called Demolishing Political Myths Face-Off, in which we will hold debates on geopolitical topics with top-level geopolitical analysts. Welcome to this first broadcast of the new series. On this occasion, we will deliberate on the figure of the Russian President Vladimir Putin, the war in Ukraine, as well as the foreign policy of Russia and NATO. And with that said, I present the first of our panelists, the first of our participants, from Miami, United States, Mr. Joseph Hage. Hello, Joseph. It's a pleasure. Welcome. How is everything over there?
Nice to greet you all. Everything's fine here. Lots of rain, but all good.
Perfect. Secondly, we have Fernando Moragón joining us from Madrid, Spain. Hello, Fernando. How's everything over there?
Well, here, unlike where Joseph is, we have sunshine, it rains very little. As he knows, it's a dry climate. And, well, we had a drop in temperatures going from 32 degrees over the weekend down to 21, 22. But anyway, we still have good weather left, and we'll see what October brings.
Well, before presenting the first topic, I want to start by thanking both of you for participating, because incredibly, even though topics like today's generate a lot of controversy, a lot of arguments, confrontations, and many opposing viewpoints, despite all that, we lack spaces for debate, for the exchange of ideas. In major media outlets, generally, those on one side participate in like-minded media, those on the other side participate in their own like-minded media, and we can't even establish a common space for dialogue, for debate, for the confrontation of ideas. That's why I want to thank both of you very, very much for taking part in this new initiative. So, seriously, truly from the heart, thank you very much. With that said, let's begin with the first topic.
Comenzamos con el primer tema. Putin, ángel o demonio, por cierto,
Putin, angel or demon. By the way, that's the title of our broadcast today. The Russian President, Vladimir Putin, is an extremely controversial figure. For some, Putin embodies authoritarianism and boundless ambition for power better than anyone else. For others, on the contrary, Putin appears as a champion of the countries of the global south in the struggle for a multipolar world order. So how should we conceptualize Putin? As a ruthless and Machiavellian tyrant, or as a defender of the interests of peoples historically oppressed by the great European powers? This is the first question, especially since today we are joined for the first time by Joseph. Joseph, the privilege of starting goes to you.
I look at Vladimir Putin from two angles, from a Russian angle and from a Western angle, so to speak. Mr. Putin, since the fall of the Soviet Union, was not convinced that the fall of the Soviet Union was fair for the Soviet Empire. At the same time, he saw that Russia as a country was losing its influence over the years, from the fall of the Berlin Wall until a few years ago, when he began a counteroffensive toward the countries that in the past were part of Russia's sphere of influence. These countries, like Georgia and Ukraine, to give two examples, were leaning more toward becoming part of the European community toward the West, and he considers that a threat. Now, there is also a philosophy behind what Mr. Vladimir Putin is doing. Mr. Vladimir Putin is influenced by a philosopher who is still alive, Mr. Alexander Dugin, in Russia, who is a Russian nationalist philosopher. At the same time, he has written more than one book, but one of Alexander Dugin's main books was about Russian nationalism, the Russian Empire, and his discomfort or lack of understanding regarding a unipolar world led by the United States. And this book, which convinced Vladimir Putin that it was so good, was made required reading in all military academies in Russia. So from this, if one reads the book and looks at the details, we realize that Mr. Vladimir Putin is convinced that Russia was an empire and must return to being an empire, and that he will not tolerate those he calls adversaries getting close to him. Although in reality, Mrs. Angela Merkel tried to dissuade him from using force and oppression and whatever else, what we're going to call what he did, whether inside Russia or with neighboring countries, occupying part of Georgia, occupying Crimea, and the latest is invading Ukraine. So here we have to understand the mentality that he wants to reestablish the Russian Empire. And this, for the West, or the European community in particular, is a red flag for them. To think long-term, that today it will start with Ukraine, tomorrow with Moldova, and who knows where it will stop after that. It could be the Baltic republics. And he, by rejecting NATO's advance and invading Ukraine, caused the two countries that had been outside of NATO for decades, like Sweden and Finland, to now become part of NATO. Now NATO's border with Russia is so long that I don't know how he, if we're talking militarily, is going to be able to deal with such a wide border. So analyzing it from the Russian side, I would be glad to have a nationalist leader for my country. But when he, as one of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, at the same time does what he does, whether it's inside Russia, against the opposition, with neighboring countries, or elsewhere using the famous, government contractor, the Wagner Group. In Africa, he used it in Syria in the past and in other places. So all of this calls Mr. Putin's intentions into question, and that's why Westerners have different ideas about what he might do now or in the future.
Well, Joseph's points are interesting and very clear. Fernando, what is your position regarding Putin? Does he actually want to re-establish a Russian empire? And could he, in this sense, launch attacks against Moldova, the Baltic countries, or even other European countries? What is your analysis from your point of view?
Well, no, neither angel nor demon, obviously. I mean, things are rarely that black and white. The first thing to say is that Putin defends the interests of Russia, or what he believes are the interests of Russia. That much is clear. From that point on, he has been characterized by an extremely moderate policy when dealing with the West, and in general, with any part of the world, tolerating all kinds of abuses since the beginning of his term, such as the expansion of NATO, etc., with warnings since 2007, with the famous Munich conference. And faced with a situation in which the United States, leading NATO, has shown that it understood nothing about what the end of the Cold War meant, and that instead of building bridges with a Russia that was no longer communist and was becoming capitalist, did the exact opposite, choosing to ignore and exploit it. Hence the terrible 1990s. And those 1990s, which were a disaster for Russia, which were ruinous when people even went hungry under Yeltsin's rule. Well, that's where Putin comes from. And Putin is aware that he does not want to return to a disaster of that kind. And let's not forget, with different stages throughout his time in power, a first stage in which he helped the United States enormously, and only when he became disillusioned with that did he begin to change his position. Let's not forget that the help Putin gave the United States in the war in Afghanistan was absolute. The northern distribution network, which the Americans used, first through the Baltics and then crossing Russia, even allowing them to use some bases to refuel planes, etc., and then going down through Central Asia, was thanks to Putin. And thanks to Putin, when Pakistan, after the assassination of bin Laden, got angry, let's say, had problems with the United States, and cut off logistics from the port of Karachi, they became completely dependent on Russia. And it was Russia that, so to speak, saved that period of operations in Afghanistan from a logistical standpoint. That is to say, Putin doesn't start out wanting an empire or anything like that. What Putin does is that he changes depending on what his, let's say, opponents are doing. That is, what the Americans and their European vassals are doing. The expansion of NATO, the missile defense shield which was aimed against them, all kinds of provocations, the withdrawal from a bunch of arms treaties, including nuclear ones. So, in the end, Putin has to defend himself. And here I disagree with my colleague. That is, Alexander Dugin has never been, let's say, Putin's go-to philosopher. In fact, Putin goes in other directions. And Alexander Dugin, who was a relatively unknown figure in Russia until not too long ago, unfortunately, until his daughter was murdered, well, he neither represented nor represents Putin's political stance or positions. In fact, Alexander Dugin is much more radical, extremely more radical. He's someone I don't agree with at all, aside from some very general elements like nationalism, but not much more than that. That is to say, as I've said, Putin is an especially moderate guy, and sometimes his moderation has cost Russia. Well, it's allowed the West, the United States, to end up taking terrible advantage of Russia. Russia doesn't have territorial problems, which is another thing they try to sell us. Let's not forget that Russia has about 146, 147 million people for a territory, a landmass that is enormous. In other words, the Russians can't fill it because they don't have enough population. So thinking that they want to add Ukraine, Moldova, and so on, no, not at all. As we all know, this war didn't start with what the Russians call the special military operation. It started in February 2022, when in 2014, after an agreement was signed and endorsed by the French and Germans, the very next day there was a coup d'etat carried out by those sponsored by the United States and NATO. From that point on, a war began between Ukrainians, a civil war in which a portion of Ukrainians was marginalized by the coup government of Ukraine at that time, and from there a war began that the West would use to provoke Russia. And this was already stated by Brzezinski in the 1990s, that what needed to be done was to use Ukraine to break up Russia.
Well, precisely in that direction, toward the war in Ukraine, I wanted to direct my next question. Indeed, the war in Ukraine is the subject of heated debates, both in the media and in academia. Some fundamental questions regarding this war. What are the causes behind its beginning? That is the first question. Who started the war, and when did the war in Ukraine begin? Joseph.
Joseph.
Fernando said something very important, that in 2014, Vladimir Putin thought he already had Ukraine back under Russian influence, like Belarus is now. But it didn't work out, because there were people against it, and they carried out a coup against the elected president, took power, and that's when the friction started. The friction in Ukraine, as in Moldova and Georgia, always happens between the minority or an enclave associated with an ethnic Russian group in that country. And Russia, under the pretext of defending ethnic Russians in these countries, has an enclave in Moldova, another enclave in Georgia, and what is now the Donbass, which is another enclave.
Esto causa fricciones en Rusia
This causes friction in Russia and also causes friction in the countries where these enclaves are located. So we can say that the conflict in Ukraine began in 2014 because Ukraine wanted to break away from Russian influence. Now, in democratic countries, this is something normal. A citizen of a country who wants to break away from the influence of a repressive neighboring country, as they call it, to move closer to another influence, which in this case is the European one, and become part of the European community. And this is what irritates Vladimir Putin, that these surrounding countries, which were part of the Soviet Union in the past, have been falling into Western hands. But the difference is that they do so voluntarily. Ukrainians are not being forced to ask to become part of the European community, nor are the Poles, nor the Baltic republics. In none of these countries were citizens forced to request annexation or to become part of the European community. Meanwhile, on the other side, we see that when Belarus was destabilized a bit, the authorities sent Vladimir Putin's special forces to completely suppress the protest. The same thing happened in another country that same year. So, this is what terrifies Europeans, including Ukrainians. They say, if we are here as citizens of Ukraine and I want to be part of the European community, it's because it's my choice. Who is Vladimir Putin to come and impose his rule or dominance in this country? And this is what is being debated now, whether to become part of Russian influence by force or to be part of Western influence voluntarily. But Vladimir Putin did not accept this. He categorically rejected the coup that happened in 2014, and to this day keeps repeating it, because they had made an agreement in Minsk, and the Europeans said, but we were not the ones who broke the Minsk agreement. It was the Ukrainians who did, because the Ukrainian delegation that signed the Minsk agreement was overthrown by the protests. And here it comes, the debate begins. Now, Ukraine also, depending on how you look at it, after the fall of the Soviet Union, had one of the largest nuclear arsenals. And it was a commitment and a promise from the European community and the United States that in exchange for Ukraine handing over its nuclear weapons to Russia, they would provide security guarantees to Ukraine. So here, the Western countries made a promise that they cannot fulfill, as they should. And on the other side, we have a claim from Russia, or from Mr. Putin, that Ukraine must return to Russian influence to protect the Russian border. And Fernando is absolutely right in saying that, as it's called, Russia has no territorial ambitions, because Russian territory is enough for the entire population of the globe. But there is political influence, strategic influence, geopolitical influence in these countries, as Russia wants, for example, to control the sea, the maritime flow in the Black Sea. That's why they took Crimea. Now, there are others who say that Crimea has always been Russian and all that. The point is that here, in the 21st century, we have to look at things from a different angle. They say, I take this over and then let them sort it out. And when Vladimir Putin did it the first time in Georgia and the second time in Crimea, and the West didn't react, he became emboldened and did what he had to do in Ukraine. Now, I can sit with a Russian for 2 days and neither will he convince me that he's right to invade Ukraine, nor will I convince him otherwise. So, we're both here at a dead end. I don't know if either of us is right, but there's a conflict, a dilemma that needs to be resolved. How to resolve it? That would be a discussion for another time.
Well, thank you very much, Joseph. Fernando, what is your analysis of the causes of the war, its beginning, its main actors, and so on?
Well, the thing is, of course, there's an interpretation here that isn't real. That is, the problem isn't that Ukraine wants to join the European Union. Putin and Russia couldn't care less if it joins the European Union. In fact, he said it again not too long ago. No, you can join the European Union. That doesn't cause me any kind of problem. The problem is if you join NATO. That's the problem. The European Union is one thing, up until now, because unfortunately the European Union is turning into a substitute military organization for NATO. In that process, in that totalitarian drift that the European Union is undergoing, trying to build a totalitarian United States of Europe, in which a non-democratic government led by Ms. von der Leyen, not elected by anyone, in other words, the European Commission, is actually already giving orders and taking on military powers that aren't in the original treaties of the European Union. But what we actually have is just the opposite. That is, it's the West that is advancing, but not the economic West, not the so-called democratic West that wants to bring Ukraine into the European Union. No, that's not the issue. Neither Russia nor anyone else has a problem with that. The problem is that it's the military West that wants to place its military weapons in Ukraine just 6 minutes by missile from Moscow. Of course, this is unacceptable, just as the Cuban Missile Crisis was unacceptable to the US government at the time. And that's the reality. And regarding the occupation of territories, look, here's the thing. We can't apply a double standard. That is to say, when people talk about territories being occupied, about Crimea being occupied, and so on, well, Crimea was occupied, let's not forget, after a civil war had already broken out, in which there was an attempt to ban the Russian language, and there was no other option but to protect the Russian population, because unlike the rest of Ukraine, the population of Crimea is mostly Russian, ethnically Russian, if you can put it that way, not just Russian-speaking. Fine. But of course there's an example that isn't mentioned, and that actually predates this in many ways. That is, there's a country called Israel that in a war occupies the Golan Heights, and after many years of occupation decides to annex them. It doesn't even hold a referendum, it just annexes them. And that is recognized by the United States. In other words, a country going against the United Nations Charter occupies some territories in a war and annexes them as part of Israel. They are now part of Israel, and on top of that, recognized by the United States. So what are we talking about? The same old double standard. And finally, the issue of nuclear weapons, which was an agreement between the Russians as heirs of the Soviet Union, the Americans, etc. It must be said that Ukraine never had control over nuclear weapons, nor did Kazakhstan or Belarus. The other nuclearized countries, after the Soviet Union disappeared, had the weapons but not the control, which was in Russia. And let's not forget, in the Constitution, when all of this happens, the Ukrainian Constitution includes a commitment to neutrality that they do not uphold. Poroshenko doesn't uphold it. Zelensky doesn't uphold it. So what are we talking about? Zelensky, who, as we all know, is a president who is no longer anything. I don't know how they even receive him at the United Nations. And this man, according to the Ukrainian Constitution, has ceased to be president and should have automatically handed over the presidency on May 20th, 2024, if I'm not mistaken. In other words, he should have automatically handed the presidency to the President of the Supreme Rada, that is, the President of the Ukrainian Parliament. They don't even respect their own laws, but that's what we're talking about. In other words, Russia intervenes when it has no other choice and in a completely defensive manner.
Bien, Joseph, tu respuesta a...
All right, Joseph, your response to Fernando's remarks. Does the West, do the United States, apply a double standard in this case?
Let's answer this separately. First, about Ukraine. Ukraine wanted to and officially requested to join NATO, but NATO never accepted Ukraine. So, maybe Vladimir Putin could have had a bit of patience to ask the Europeans not to accept Ukraine into NATO, because it was never accepted. There were many rumors, but Ukraine was never accepted as part of NATO. So here one could say, yes, but they asked for it, but well, they never got it. It was never accepted. It's not that the Europeans accepted it and Vladimir Putin rejected it. No. The issue is that Ukraine's membership was not accepted, neither when they requested it, nor when they formally applied to NATO. Now, regarding double standards, it's not the same. We're not comparing apples to apples, because the Golan Heights. It was Syria that attacked Israel in 73, and the Israeli counteroffensive won the territory of the Golan Heights. They weren't given away. Nor was it that Israel started the war against Syria. It was the other way around. Israel defended itself against Syria and Egypt in 1973. And this was after the same thing happened in 67. All the countries attacked Israel. The West Bank was part of Jordan, and the Gaza Strip was part of Egypt. They were the ones who attacked Israel in June of 67. They lost the Gaza Strip, they lost the Sinai, they lost, that's right, Jordan and part of the Golan Heights. In 73, the scenario repeated. Egypt and Syria attacked. On the same day, Egypt managed to penetrate the Sinai Desert. There was the famous case of one brigade surrounding another brigade, then one army surrounding another, and so on. It was resolved with the peace process with Egypt. But Syria lost what remained of the Golan Heights in a war that Syria started. So in this case, it's not comparable, because here Ukraine wasn't the one who attacked Russia to take its territory. There were already some Russian renegades, ethnic Russians, receiving military aid from Russia for the war that Fernando called a civil war. But I don't know if they were repressed. Maybe they were, but I'm not sure it reached the level of a civil war. But when the military clashes began between the ethnic Russian groups and the Ukrainians, that's when it really became a civil war, because they're two Ukrainian groups. One wants a Russian alliance or influence, the other wants an independent or European influence. And of course, that's going to end in a civil war. There's no other way out. One side or the other will win.
Well then, if I am interpreting your argument correctly, Joseph, in the case of Israel, the occupation of the Golan Heights was a response to an initial attack by Syria, and that validates Israel's occupation.
No, it doesn't justify it. But throughout history, look, I don't have to go far. The United States, there were states that used to be part of Mexico. Mexico lost them in 1880 in a war. So what? Is Mexico going to come now and try to reclaim its territory? That's not how things work. Once a territory is lost in a war, that's where it stays. Israel returned the Sinai Desert to Egypt in exchange for peace. But in other parts of the world, when a territory is won, it's never given back. Take Turkey. To this day, it occupies part of Europe. That area isn't part of Turkey. Turkey is east of the Bosphorus, not west. But the west was invaded. So there's a lot to compare here. But I mean, let's not compare the Golan Heights to what's happening in Ukraine, because we're not talking about the same media coverage. That's all I wanted to say.
Bien, Fernando.
Well, Fernando, yes. No, look, I think it's absolutely irrelevant whether the war was started by one side or the other, because once that war is resolved, and one side wins and the other loses, as usually happens, and they take over territories that were not part of their country, in this case Israel, from that point on, you can manage those occupied territories, but you cannot annex them, because they are still part of that country from the perspective of international law. We already know that the West doesn't care at all about international law, and what is currently being imposed is the international order based on rules, which is basically the international order that I feel like imposing. As we have seen today, or rather these days at the United Nations, Trump is absolutely doing whatever he wants and making a mockery of the Europeans and a lot of other people. That is to say, if we apply the pragmatism of power and realism, then there's nothing to criticize the Russians for, because any territory that ends up in Russian hands will be the result of a war. It will become history. And therefore, just as the Ottomans lost all the Balkans, well, or just as the Americans took over more than 55% of what was then Mexico, well, indeed, history has many wars and there are changes of borders and territories. But as I said, from the perspective of the United Nations Charter and international law, the Golan Heights are Syrian. That is, even if Syria lost the war or started it. One of the key points, which unfortunately has not been upheld, is that territories cannot be separated or annexed. We have another example in Kosovo, where NATO overstepped and went to war to separate a part of the territory from a sovereign country recognized by NATO, which was Serbia, the Republic of Serbia and Montenegro. What we are seeing here is once again double standards. When it suits us, we wage war against a sovereign country, take a piece of it, and that is justified. But if Russia does it, it's not. So if Russia keeps Crimea or supports Donbass, Lugansk, and Donetsk, then Russia is imperialist, it's bad, it wants to invade all of Europe. So which is it? Come on. I mean, we're always using double standards, and as I said, just look at the case of Georgia. By the way, Georgia right now doesn't get along with Russia. They're on bad terms for obvious reasons. But one of the things that Georgian Dream, the ruling party in Georgia, keeps saying is that they're not willing to fall into the same trap that the Ukrainians have fallen into because of the West. In other words, they are not willing to send weapons to Ukraine. They are not willing to confront Russia. They don't have the slightest sense. And above all, what they are not willing to accept is for the European Union, with the help of the United States, to carry out color revolutions. 4 have been carried out against the party in recent years, to undemocratically overthrow a party that wins the elections, which is Georgian Dream. People may like it more or less, but that's what the Georgians vote for. And they've said it again recently. The Prime Minister, well, in short, they keep trying to undemocratically bring down the Georgian Dream Party and the current government simply because it doesn't suit them, as always. And watch out, we have to keep one thing in mind. There's so much talk about Russia, but when it intervenes in the 5-day war, in the war in Georgia, it's because the absolutely disgraceful Saakashvili attacks South Ossetia and attacks a peacekeeping force that had been agreed upon by both sides, which was Russian. By attacking Russians and killing Russians, Russia has no choice but to intervene. But in fact, it's Georgia that in that intervention loses South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which until that moment had not been recognized by the Russians as independent entities. It's always the same story.
Well, beyond the discussion about double standards, whether yes or no, if in one case a country takes an action and the world rejects it due to a certain interpretation, and in another case another country takes a similar action and the world validates it, beyond that discussion, often in international relations, in geopolitics, in international law, it is not international law that ultimately determines conflicts, but rather it is often force, power, the ius ad bellum in Roman terms, the right acquired by force, by war, that ultimately determines the resolution of conflicts.
La resolución de los conflictos. Ahora bien, desde ese punto de vista.
Now then, from that point of view, is Russia's military intervention since 2008 justified from a realist perspective, in the sense that it responds to a real threat to Russia's security, at least from the political perception of the Russians? Or is it actually not a justified action beyond its legality or illegality, but rather a response to Putin's expansionist ambitions? That's the question, Joseph.
Esa la pregunta, Joseph.
For me, this was a challenge from Putin to the West through Ukraine. He wanted to challenge NATO, the European community, and to some extent the United States. He made the move, that's what he did, but he didn't expect to get stuck in that quagmire from which he couldn't get out so easily. I believe that, according to the military plans we saw in the first week, he thought that within a week, Kiev would be under his control and the matter would be over. His calculation didn't work out, and the Ukrainians themselves surprised not only their own people, but also the Europeans and the United States by rejecting this advance toward the capital, which changed the course of the battle at this level. Whether it is justified or not depends on whom you ask. If you support Vladimir Putin, of course you justify it. If you support the Ukrainians, no, you don't justify it. So there's no black and white here. Everyone sees the situation from their own perspective. There are two viewpoints. Maybe both are valid, but they clash in a place where one supports one side more than the other. But I don't know if I personally would say that Vladimir Putin had to invade. There were other ways to influence the situation. Marguerite, the direction of Russian influence in Ukraine, whether economically or through other means he had. All the oil that passed through Ukraine, for which he paid Ukraine money for the pipelines, today those pipelines could have been suspended. This could, I don't know. There were ways, very, very good ways, but he had already made up his mind. And I think it was because he had the impression that Ukraine was going to become part of NATO and that missiles would be deployed in Ukraine, close to the Russian capital, in a military sense. That was his justification. Or at least that's what Russian politicians have said over time. But now, whether it's justified or not, the way things are in Russia, now, the economy, the lives that have been lost, I'm talking mostly about Russians, I don't know if his move was justified. All this sacrifice for what he did. I have a lot of doubts about whether that's justified.
All right, Fernando, your perspective, your response to this.
I think he had no other choice. Another thing is that while it's true that the first operation, that is the first part of the operation, didn't go well for him, the special military operation didn't go well for him. Because what he really wanted was, let's say, a quick strike that would quickly put an end to NATO's interference in Ukraine. Because let's not forget the famous Maidan scenes with Victoria Nuland and company, with Western politicians supporting in an absolutely outrageous way, in other words, undemocratically, a movement against a President Yanukovych, who, yes, was corrupt, but had been democratically elected. Well, I think clearly he has no other choice. Just like Kennedy had no other choice, meaning President John F. Kennedy, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That is, you can't have weapons, especially nuclear weapons, in Cuba, which is right next to the United States, where I have no defensive capability. It's exactly the same. Ukraine, even before the Russian invasion, Zelensky said he wanted to go nuclear, meaning he wanted to have nuclear weapons. And obviously, regarding NATO, it's not that NATO rejected Ukraine, because it has never rejected Ukraine's candidacy. It was NATO, with Bush at the conference, if I remember correctly, in Bucharest, that opened up the possibility, especially the United States, saying that Georgia and Ukraine could join NATO. They didn't say when or how or in what way, but they opened up that possibility. By opening up that possibility, they're just continuing to move forward. Let's not forget that the missile defense system had already been installed in Romania and Poland, and also in Spain, though that's farther away. And of course, what Putin constantly sees is a NATO that, let's remember, is a military organization, not an NGO. That is, it keeps advancing and advancing, trying to get closer. And then they say, no, NATO says, no, but if we're moving forward, it's not against Russia, it's against Iran, who are very bad and very wicked. And then Putin says, well, if it's against Iran, then let's make a joint missile defense system. And of course, the United States says, no, 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 no way. Not at all. It means that he did everything possible to reach agreements with NATO. And NATO, let's not forget, this was acknowledged by German Chancellor Merkel and later by François Hollande. No, the whole thing was a setup. That is, the Minsk agreements were made with no intention of being fulfilled. What we wanted was to deceive the Russians and buy time to rearm Ukraine against Russia. This is acknowledged by Angela Merkel and François Hollande, who are not suspected of being pro-Russian. He had no other choice, that is, a Ukraine that was de facto NATOized, which it already was, that was willing to have NATO bases, something it already had to some extent, and that was willing to deploy all kinds of weaponry, even if not nuclear, but which, due to the distances and proximity, endangered Russia. This cannot be allowed, and there is a basic principle that was applied in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and should have been applied now, and which many people defend. You cannot build the security of one group, of one country, at the expense of another's security. You cannot build Ukraine's security by undermining Russia's security. This can't be. And NATO cannot build security, we don't even know against whom, but anyway, at the expense of Russia's security. That's why Russia had to do what it did. That's just how it is. And it's not Russia that wants this. We don't see that it's NATO right now, and especially the European part of NATO, that's leading us into a war against Russia. A war in which, on the one hand, we're told that the Russians are terrible and are going to invade all of Europe. Oh well, okay, very powerful. And on the other hand, we're told that Russia is very weak, and the proof is that in all these years they've only managed to acquire about 20% of Ukrainian territory. So which is it?
Is it very strong or very weak? Precisely, Fernando. What is the current situation of the war? Russian superiority, Ukrainian superiority, stalemate. What is the state of the war in Ukraine today?
Joseph.
Look, according to more than one military analyst, that war was not a success for Russia. It cost many lives, and the weakness of this Russian tiger has been exposed in front of Europe. Even with all the support Ukraine is getting, they still aren't being given truly offensive support, up to a certain point. The drones Ukraine is using now are made in Ukraine, they're not even imported. But it has been shown, with what happened on the ground in all the clashes, that Russia might be able to make small advances in Ukraine, but if it enters a war against NATO, it doesn't stand a chance. There's no way they can make any progress or sustain a long-term war against NATO. This is already evident on the ground. And now, with the Russians, or Vladimir Putin in particular, getting tougher, if they really are going to give offensive weapons to the Ukrainians, this war is going to go in a different direction. It could get very ugly too, because the more you pressure the Russian army, the more violent Vladimir Putin will become, and there's no limit for him. It's not like we can say, well, under pressure he'll give in. No. Vladimir Putin is not the kind of person who's going to give in to anything. We already know that. And I don't like this very much. It's concerning to put pressure on Vladimir Putin. I prefer that, in order to get Vladimir Putin to come to the table and resolve the issue of Ukraine, they use economic pressure. And President Trump still has a very strong, very effective tool to use if he decides to, which is oil. Because if he comes to an agreement with his friend Mohammed bin Salman to increase oil production and bring the price down to $30, like what happened in the last years of President Obama's term, and he talks about Vladimir Putin, Putin would be forced to sit at the negotiating table because he wouldn't be able to finance the war. He's selling his oil, according to market sources, at $17 below the Brent price. If the price on the open market drops to $30 a barrel, minus 17, that's below Russia's production cost. So there are still opportunities not to threaten them, but to force them to sit at the table and end this confrontation. But if they insist on choosing this confrontation no matter what, I don't see an acceptable outcome from a humanitarian point of view, because there will be many victims, many civilians on both sides who will pay the price, and I would prefer that the pressure still leads to an agreement that Russia can accept for its security, and that Ukraine, as well as the Europeans, can also have peace of mind regarding their security. The issue here is that they have a reputation, in the past, for being on the side of the Soviet Union and the Russians. From Joseph Stalin to Leonid Brezhnev, until the Soviet Union fell, that time was brutal for all these countries. I remember I was 10 years old when I saw the Prague Spring. What happened? And I still can't get that black and white image of tanks entering a public square out of my mind. So, when Europeans say they want security, that they're afraid, and so on, it's because there's still a certain generation that remembers, that recalls what the Russians or the Soviet Union did back then in those countries. In Ukraine, they have the infamous famine they suffered during Joseph Stalin's era. They don't forget it. They teach it in schools. So here, everyone needs to work together so that they feel safe in the future, and so that Russia doesn't feel threatened by a NATO that's knocking at its door.
Well, Fernando, Russia is indeed a paper tiger, as Trump described it in his latest statement.
Well, in any case, as Putin's presidential spokesperson said, it will be a bear, not a tiger. But of course, because the tiger doesn't fit. In any case, the tiger might go to India, perhaps, or the elephant, but anyway. No, jokes aside. Look, this idea that the Russian economy is collapsing, not at all. The Russian economy is much healthier than the European one. That's the one that's actually collapsing. We have France, which is a ticking time bomb, and we also have public and private debt in Europe that's skyrocketing, in most countries above 100% of GDP. And as for France, I won't even get started. It's terrible. So what we really have is a wild economic crisis, caused in part by absurd measures, by sanctions, by European self-sanctions.
Por las medidas absurdas, por las sanciones, las autosanciones europeas. No hay cosa más absurda que ponerse autosanciones.
There is nothing more absurd than imposing sanctions on ourselves. That is, they harm Europe and benefit Russia. The issue of oil. Let's see, I still don't think it's been understood that. And Wang Yi said it, the Minister of Foreign Affairs said it in a meeting with the disgraceful Kaja Kallas, a woman who is illiterate, I'm sorry, but that's how it is. Just like the previous Minister of Foreign Affairs, Annalena Baerbock, who is now President of the United Nations Assembly, and we've already seen how the Assembly has started. She's known as Lena 360 because she can't tell the difference between 180 degrees and 360 degrees, among other things. Well, with this bunch of European politicians who are illiterate and incompetent, what we have is a devastating economic crisis that they have imposed on themselves. The minister said 2 years ago, in other words, the Swedish finance minister at that time, I don't remember the name, that they had imposed sanctions on Russia without knowing whether it would harm Europe or not. But whose hands are we in if they impose sanctions without knowing what they're doing? I mean, regarding oil. Sorry, I think I was losing my train of thought.
The military situation in the war, whether Russia has superiority, whether Ukraine has superiority, or whether there is a stalemate. In that sense, does Russia represent a paper tiger or not?
Sí, no, simplemente decir que mientras tengan el apoyo.
Simply put, as long as they have the support of India, and above all China, the Russian economy is not going to have problems. We're talking about, and Wang Yi said, we are not going to let Russia lose. That's it, he told Hage this summer at a meeting prior to the celebration of 50 years of relations between China and the European Union and so on. Well, it's clear, out of self-interest, China is never going to let Russia fall. And if Russia has China behind it, its economy is going to do just fine. As for the war, well, the Russians, after their initial mistake, and let's not forget that it could have been resolved in March 2022, and it was Europe, it was Boris Johnson who went to Kiev to say, no, Mr. Zelensky, no kind of peace agreement. The agreement was already practically in place. There was a draft approved by both parties, and it was the West that said, no, the war must continue. It's clear who wanted the war and who didn't. In the case of Boris Johnson, the Anglo-Saxons and the Europeans, they forced the Ukrainians to continue a war they cannot win, because ultimately, let's not forget that Russia is the world's leading nuclear power. It currently has hypersonic missiles. It has, for example, that nuclear torpedo capable of causing tsunamis, the Poseidon. It has a lot of things that the United States, which would theoretically be the second nuclear power, does not have. That is to say, if Russia were to find itself in any real danger, as Putin has already said, in a situation of existential threat, then it's over. Over these 3 years, we've already come pretty close to some of these situations, especially with what we're saying about NATO. Look, European armies are useless. They can't even put on a parade. We see it every day. The only army that works is the American one. And then come on, saying they aren't being given offensive weapons, please. What is a tank? A shield. A tank is an offensive weapon. The Leopards, the Abrams, the Challenger 2s. I mean, come on. The planes, well, all of this, of course, anything can be defensive or offensive depending on how you look at it. But they've been given weapons, everything they've wanted. The Storm Shadow, that is, the British missiles and their French version, the Scalp, missiles capable of striking Russian territory at a certain depth. They've been given everything. Artillery. In other words, they have been given all kinds of armored vehicles, the Bradleys. That is, they have been given everything. And let's be honest, what Russia has shown is that it has a much more powerful military industry than the European military industry, even more than the American military industry. The Ukrainians themselves are saying this. That is, they are scared because they are seeing how the Geranium-2 drones, which are the improved copy of the Iranian Shahed drones, have already surpassed 800 attacks per day and daily production. It will soon reach 1,000. The Ukrainians were even saying with fear that by the end of this year it could easily reach 2,000. That is, the launch of 2,000 long-range drones like the Geranium-2 or the Geranium-3, which is the version with a rocket engine. This shows that Russia's armament capacity and potential is far superior to that of NATO. In fact, Russia is achieving something unthinkable, and let's not forget that this is a NATO war against Russia in Ukraine, and Russia is winning. And they are going to win. This is realism. It's not a matter of being better or worse. This is realism. That is to say, NATO does not have the capacity to produce the amount of weaponry or the combat experience that Russia currently has. The previous head of NATO, General Cavoli, admitted it. Russia is currently the most powerful military force, #1 in the world.
Joseph, your response.
I don't disagree that much with some of the things Fernando says, but that idea of Russian military power doesn't convince me at all, because I don't think, comparing apples to apples, that Russia is on the same level, I don't know, not even with the United States or NATO in general. But anyway, that's debatable, because you have to break it down, by tanks, by drones, by that. But there isn't enough time to debate it. Based on that, I think Russia's role will remain limited to what it is now. There won't be any further advances, and most likely in the end, they'll sit down at the negotiating table.
Well, then I'll link your answer to the next question. Considering both of your analyses of the situation in the war, what are the viable options, the possible ways out at this moment, regarding the resolution of the conflict? Joseph.
For me, what President Trump once said is true. To reach an agreement, neither side can surrender. Neither one is going to give in, nor is the other going to declare victory. It will be a victory where both sides get as much as they can from what they're asking for, 60% of what they want, 50% each, to end up with a peaceful solution. Otherwise, it will end in a war between powers, and I don't know if the powers are willing to enter into that war.
Fernando, what's your perspective?
I
believe that, as President Trump has demonstrated, what he wants is to get out of this mess, which he always blames on the Biden era and has already said many times cannot be won, that it's a war that cannot be won. Getting out of this, as he has shown in his latest statements at the United Nations, means, let's say, shifting the problem to the Europeans, that it should be the Europeans by buying American weapons who resolve the issue. I'm leaving, and he's becoming more and more clear about this. He keeps buying time and saying, well, let the Russians keep fighting the war there with the Ukrainians and the Ukrainians with the Russians, because he knows perfectly well that the Russians are going to end up winning. That is to say, because this shouldn't be seen in terms of territorial gains, with the Russians advancing every day, since this is a war of positions and a war of attrition. In a war of positions and attrition, what both sides aim for is to eliminate the enemy's ability to fight, in other words, to destroy the opposing army. And what we're seeing is a Russian army that is increasingly larger, more powerful, with more men, and a Ukrainian army that is increasingly weakened, lacking personnel. If they don't have personnel, due to demographic reasons, it's because they simply don't have enough people. So, Ukraine's defeat is inevitable.
Your point is also very clear. The last question to wrap up this debate, regarding Trump, who was recently mentioned, his arrival to the presidency of the United States sparked intense debates about NATO. What mission should NATO actually have today, and what stance should it take toward Russia?
Joseph.
Look, the purpose of, let's call it the attack, or this hostility from President Trump against NATO was about funding. The NATO members were finally convinced that each country needs to increase its defense budget from 1 or 2% to 5% of their GDP, gross domestic product, and with that, President Trump is satisfied. Mr. Trump's mentality or policy is that he doesn't want to shoulder the burden of European wars. He wants Europeans to have enough to defend themselves, and when help is needed, the United States is willing to be part of it. Now, President Trump is very pleased with what the Europeans have offered in terms of their defense budgets, except for Spain, of course. And in this case, he is willing to participate with them. He told them the same thing regarding the issue of Ukraine, that for now the United States has spent more money than all the Europeans combined. In the meantime, you are going to spend on armaments until at least we are both even in the amount of money spent, until it reaches a point where both of us can help Ukraine. So he is doing what any president should do, which is to look for what is in the best interest of the United States, whether with allies or adversaries. And in this case, President Trump is doing just that. He is not doing anything else.
Bien.
Alright, Fernando, what position should NATO take regarding Russia? What should NATO's mission be at present? What's your analysis?
Let's see, very quickly. This started much earlier, meaning that once the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact disappeared, NATO should have disappeared as well. Let's not forget that NATO was created to fight on European soil against the Soviet Union. Later, the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact. NATO came first and then the Warsaw Pact. Once your enemy has disappeared, there's no point in having NATO, which has tried to internationalize itself, becoming a sort of world police. But there's also an effectiveness issue. That is, NATO has shown in Afghanistan, in a bunch of wars, in Western countries, in Iraq, etc., that it doesn't work, that it loses wars. In other words, it's a dysfunctional organization. Let's not forget that NATO, the richest countries with the best and highest quality weaponry, were unable in 20 years to defeat the Taliban, a group of men who are illiterate, who basically wear sandals, and who used Soviet-era, old, and let's say, not high-capacity weapons, but small arms. Well, in 20 years, they couldn't do it. If that's not enough reason for NATO to dissolve, then someone should explain to me what is. Because let's not forget that NATO is not an NGO. It's a military organization that at a given moment claims the right to intervene anywhere in the world, and on top of that, loses. NATO is dysfunctional. Like all the organizations that emerged at the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. We are in a different historical period now, and all those kinds of organizations are already obsolete. They are organizations that, regardless of whether you consider them good or bad, everyone can have their own opinion, simply do not work. It's like trying to bring back the Roman legions today. In other words, they're useless. At the time, of course, they served a purpose, and they did so, but now they don't. NATO is a problem. NATO in Europe makes no sense today. And what we should be seeking is a European agreement, also with the United States and of course with Russia, for common security across the entire European continent. What NATO doesn't want, of course. Because NATO, as I said, is an organization dedicated to expanding its power and is currently showing its absolute ineffectiveness. And let's not forget, the leader of NATO, the United States, is the first to distrust its European allies, whom it has considered since the Kosovo War as a bunch of useless people incapable of carrying out a halfway serious operation without the Americans helping them. So this is the situation. What Trump has done is tell the Europeans, gentlemen, there's your problem. Deal with it however you can. You buy weapons from us, we sell them, and you do whatever you want with those weapons. The conflict has become completely intertwined.
To wrap up the broadcast, Joseph, would you like to respond to Fernando's perspective?
No, he's already said it throughout this entire broadcast. His point is, I've already realized that he's anti-NATO, pro-Russian, etc. It's just that there are two different perspectives. It's not that he's wrong and I'm right, no. It's that they're two opposing perspectives. And well, time will tell which one of us is right, or maybe there will never be a clear answer for either side. We'll see in the future what happens with NATO and with Russia. But for now, that's the situation on the ground. There's a dilemma that needs to be resolved.
Well, thank you very much, Joseph. This is our agreement, 1 hour. In fact, thank you very much, Joseph, for delaying your departure a little, because he has a commitment now. To both of you, thank you so much for a high-level debate, with very clear and solid arguments, but at the same time, very respectful. Honestly, there are few debates like this generally in the media, even on social networks, so thank you so much. And with this marks the first episode of this series of debates on our channel.
Debates dentro de nuestro canal. Seguramente presentaremos más debates sobre otras cuestiones como
We will surely present more debates on other issues, such as the conflict in the Middle East, Iran, China, and so on. Both Fernando and Joseph will participate again in the future, for sure. Demoledores and Demolidoras. In about an hour, Adrian Zelaya's broadcast will begin on our sister channel MP Geopolitica, with a retransmission on our channel, and we'll be back here tomorrow once again with Juan Antonio Aguilar in a conversation with him. That said, Demoledores and Demoldoras, a hug, and see you soon. Bye-bye, see you later, thank you.
Hasta luego, gracias.
Luego.
Yeah.